She thought losing her husband to a younger woman was the worst day of her life. She was wrong. When 47-year-old Maggie Reynolds discovered her millionaire husband was cheating with a 28-year-old actress, she thought her world had ended. But then came the real betrayal. He wasn't just leaving her, he was framing her for $12 million in embezzlement, planning to send her to prison while he walked away with everything. What Richard Reynolds didn't know, the woman he had controlled for 22 years was about to discover a secret that would flip their entire world upside down. A secret worth $200 million. A secret that would prove he never built his empire alone, and she held the power to destroy it all. This is not just a story about divorce. This is a story about a woman who rose from the ashes of betrayal to become more powerful than the man who tried to destroy her. What you're about to hear will show you that your worst moment can become your greatest turning point. No matter your age, no matter how much you've lost, it is never too late to discover who you were always meant to be. This story reminds us of three powerful truths. First, your value is never determined by someone else's treatment of you. Second, the people who underestimate you often become the architects of their own downfall. And third, sometimes life doesn't fall apart. It falls into place. On a Tuesday morning, the phone rang at exactly 7:32. Maggie Reynolds knew the time with certainty because her eyes were fixed on the digital clock in her kitchen, watching the seconds pass as the coffee in her hands grew cold. "Is this Mrs. Reynolds?" The voice was unfamiliar and professional. "Yes, this is Margaret Reynolds." "Ma'am, my name is Detective Sarah Walsh from the Manhattan Police Department. We need you to come to the station. This is about your husband, Richard Reynolds." The coffee mug slipped from Maggie's fingers, crashing against the marble floor of their Park Avenue penthouse. "Mrs. Reynolds, are you still there?" Maggie could only stare at the dark liquid spreading across the flawless white marble. Feeling as if the 22 years of her meticulously built life were starting to fracture right along with the porcelain. I am here. What has happened? Is Rick hurt? No, ma'am, he is not hurt, but there has been an incident involving your husband and a young actress named Sophia Blake. The media is already describing it as the scandal of the year. Maria, their housekeeper, suddenly appeared in the doorway, her face filled with concern. She had been cleaning the Reynolds penthouse for 15 years and had never once seen Maggie drop so much as a napkin. "Mrs. Maggie, are you all right?" Maria asked in her gentle accent, already starting to clean up the broken porcelain. Maggie held up a hand to stop her, still gripping the phone tightly. "Detective Walsh, what kind of incident?" "Ma'am, your husband was photographed leaving the Ritz-Carlton at 2 in the morning with Miss Blake. There are also allegations of financial misconduct at his company. We need you to come in and answer a few questions." The detective's words struck Maggie like actual blows. Her millionaire husband, who was about to become her ex-husband, had been cheating and was apparently also stealing. The perfect life she had constructed, the careful ascent up the social ladder, the charity galas, the perfectly decorated penthouse, all of it was falling apart. "I will be there in an hour," she managed to reply. "Mrs. Maggie?" Maria was still standing nearby, broom in hand, looking worried. "It is all right, Maria. Just leave it for now." Maggie's voice sounded strange to her, unnaturally calm. "I need to get dressed and go downtown." She walked to her bedroom in a trance, her bare feet silent on the Italian marble. The master suite was a testament to Rick's success. With its 1,200 thread count Egyptian cotton sheets, a custom mahogany headboard that cost more than most people's cars, and a walk-in closet larger than many Manhattan apartments. Maggie stood in front of her mirror and studied the reflection of a 47-year-old woman who had just found out her entire life was a fabrication. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was still perfectly styled from yesterday's salon visit. Her skin was smooth, thanks to the best dermatologist money could afford. She was wearing a silk nightgown that cost $800, and none of it meant anything anymore. She chose a navy blue Chanel suit, a form of armor, for what was to come. As she dressed, her mind began to function again, moving beyond the shock and towards something harder and more focused. 22 years of marriage, and she was learning from a police detective that her husband was having an affair, not from Rick himself, not from the society gossips, who usually knew everything first, but from a complete stranger on the phone. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like it lasted an eternity. Harold, the doorman, tipped his hat as she walked past. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds. Shall I call a car for you?" "Yes, please." The police station downtown. If Harold was surprised, he did not show it. In Manhattan, the wealthy often had all kinds of peculiar destinations. The taxi ride through morning traffic allowed Maggie time to think. She pulled out her phone and did the one thing she had been avoiding. She searched her husband's name online. The headlines were unavoidable. Chief Executive Officer Richard Reynolds caught in hotel rendezvous with actress Sophia Blake. Torn apart. Reynolds Industries stock plummets amid scandal. Power couple divorce looming. The photos were damning. Rick, her distinguished 52-year-old husband, caught in what was clearly a lover's embrace with a woman young enough to be his daughter. Sophia Blake was 28 years old, blonde, beautiful, and everything that Maggie was not. Her phone buzzed with text messages from concerned friends, but she ignored all of them. There would be time for explanations later. The police station stood like a granite fortress in lower Manhattan, surrounded by news vans and photographers. Maggie paid the taxi driver and walked through the crowd with her head held high, ignoring the shouted questions and the flashes of cameras. "Mrs. Reynolds, how long have you known about the affair? Margaret, will you be filing for divorce? Any comment on your husband's business practices?" She pushed through the glass doors of the precinct, thankful for the comparative quiet inside. "Mrs. Reynolds?" A woman in her 40s approached her, a badge visible on her belt. "I am Detective Walsh. Thank you for coming in." "What is really going on, Detective? Let's sit down, and I will explain everything." They settled into a small conference room that had fluorescent lighting and industrial carpet. Detective Walsh opened a thick file folder. "Mrs. Reynolds, we have been investigating some irregularities at Reynolds Industries for several months. Last night we were performing surveillance when we observed your husband meeting with Miss Blake. During the course of that surveillance, we uncovered evidence of what appears to be embezzlement from his own company." The words washed over Maggie like ice water. "Embezzlement? It appears your husband has been transferring funds from the company's charitable foundation into personal accounts. We are talking about several $1,000,000 over the past 3 years." Maggie felt something cold settle deep in her stomach. The charitable foundation was her project. She had founded it, run it, and organized every single fundraiser. Her name was on every board document. "Detective, are you suggesting that I am under investigation too?" "Right now, we are just collecting information." "But Mrs. Reynolds, I need to ask, did you have any awareness of these financial transfers?" "Absolutely not." The answer was immediate and came with complete certainty. "I manage the day-to-day operations of the foundation, but Rick handles all the financial oversight. He always said it was too complicated for me to worry about." Even as she spoke the words, Maggie felt a flash of anger at herself. Too complicated for her, as if she were a child who could not understand money. "We will need you to come in again tomorrow with your attorney to give a formal statement," Detective Walsh said. "For now, I would suggest you contact a good divorce lawyer. And Mrs. Reynolds? Yes. I would also recommend you freeze any joint accounts and obtain copies of all your financial records. Today. Maggie walked out of the police station feeling as though she were moving underwater. Everything looked different now. The morning sunlight seemed harsher, the traffic louder, and the faces of strangers more hostile. Her phone was ringing non-stop with calls from friends, reporters, and business associates. She turned it off and flagged down another taxi. "Where to, lady?" She almost said home, but then stopped herself. That penthouse was not home anymore. It was just another beautiful prison she had been living in without realizing it. "Reynolds Industries," she said. "Midtown." It was time to confront her millionaire ex-husband face to face. The glass towers of Midtown Manhattan gleamed in the morning sun as Maggie's taxi pulled up to Reynolds Industries. The 50-story building was Rick's monument to himself, his name etched in gold letters across the marble facade. 3 hours after the phone call that changed her entire life, Maggie stood in the marble lobby, watching employees whisper and point. Word travels quickly in the corporate world, and everyone knew something was wrong when the chief executive officer's wife showed up looking as if she were ready for war. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like ascending to an execution. Maggie watched the numbers climb, each floor bringing her closer to a confrontation she had never imagined having. Rick's secretary, Amanda, looked up with barely hidden panic when Maggie stepped off the elevator. "Mrs. Reynolds? Mr. Reynolds he's in a meeting, a very important meeting. Maybe you could come back later." "Amanda, I have known you for 8 years. Do not lie to me now." Maggie's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath the silk. "Where is my husband?" "Boardroom B," Amanda whispered, unable to meet her eyes. Maggie walked down the hallway she had traveled hundreds of times for company events and Christmas parties. The walls were lined with photos of Rick shaking hands with politicians, celebrities, and business leaders. In many of them, she stood right beside him, smiling and elegant, the perfect corporate wife. She paused outside the heavy wooden doors of Boardroom B, hearing voices inside. She recognized Rick's familiar baritone, along with several others belonging to senior executives. "The bottom line is, we need to contain this story," Rick was saying. "I do not care what it costs. Pay off whoever needs to be paid off. Threaten whoever needs to be threatened." "Rick, the photos are already everywhere," another voice replied. "And the police investigation?" "Let me worry about the police. I have donated enough to their benevolent fund over the years. They will play ball." Maggie pushed open the doors without knocking. 7 men in expensive suits turned to stare at her. Rick was standing at the head of the conference table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Armani suit immaculate. He looked every inch the successful chief executive officer until you saw his eyes. "Gentlemen," Rick said, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet, "could you give my wife and me a moment?" The executives scurried out of the room like scolded puppies, none daring to look at Maggie. Once the door clicked shut, the silence was heavy enough to feel. "Maggie," Rick started, using that patronizing tone he reserved for explaining simple things to people he thought were simple-minded. "I know how this must look." "Let's just get to the point, Rick," she said, turning his own favorite phrase against him. "How long? How long what? Do not play dumb with me. How long have you been sleeping with Sophia Blake?" Rick's hand went to his tie. It was a nervous tell he had whenever he was trapped. "Maggie, this is complicated. You have no idea the kind of pressure I am under, the demands of running a company of this size." "How long?" The question was sharp, hanging between them like a guillotine. Rick turned his back on her, walking over to the massive windows that overlooked the city. 8 months, he finally admitted. 8 months. While Maggie had been orchestrating charity balls and hosting perfect dinner parties, while she had been the flawless wife, he had been constructing a separate life without her. And the embezzlement? Rick whipped around, his face turning a deep shade of red. That is not embezzlement. That money was always mine. I built this company from the ground up. I started that foundation. Maggie shot back, her voice finally rising. I am the one who wrote the mission statement. I organized every single event. I charmed every last donor, and you have been stealing from it. I have not been stealing anything. I was moving assets to shield them from potential lawsuits. It is a strategy called financial planning, Maggie, but the details would be too complex for you to grasp. Stop. The word cracked like a whip. Stop speaking to me as if I am a child, Richard. I may not have a fancy business degree from Wharton, but I am not an idiot. For a split second, a look of what might have been regret flashed across Rick's face. But it vanished so quickly, Maggie wondered if she had imagined it. Maggie, please sit down. Let's talk about this like two rational adults. I am talking like an adult. You are the one who has been behaving like a teenager with a stolen credit card. She kept her feet firmly planted, her fingers digging into the back of a leather chair. Tell me about Sophia. What is there to tell? Is she pregnant? The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Rick's jaw clenched, and Maggie knew the answer before he even opened his mouth. Yes. The word landed like a punch to the gut. 22 years of marriage, and they had never been able to have children. It was not because they had not tried. They had poured a fortune into fertility treatments, suffering through years of clinical tests, invasive procedures, and crushing disappointments. Rick had always insisted it did not matter, that their life together was whole without children. Apparently, it only did not matter when the children would have been with Maggie. How far along is she? 4 months. 4 months? Maggie quickly did the mental arithmetic. Sophia Blake had become pregnant right around the time of Rick's 50th birthday party. The extravagant gala Maggie had spent 3 months planning. I want a divorce, Rick blurted out, the words tumbling out of him. Maggie, I want a divorce. Sophia is pregnant, and I am going to marry her. And there it was, 22 years of her life, erased in just 2 sentences. I see. Maggie's voice remained unnervingly calm, but she felt a deep crack form inside her as the final piece of her old identity crumbled away. And you figured you would soften the landing by stealing millions of dollars from our foundation first? I have not stolen a thing, Rick snapped. Everything I did was perfectly legal. And to be honest, Maggie, you should show some gratitude. Did you really think you would have any of this without me? He waved his hand around the lavish boardroom, a gesture that included the penthouse, the designer clothes, their entire lifestyle. You were a nobody when we met, just a secretary at some law firm. A paralegal, Maggie corrected him softly. Whatever, the point is, I created you. I gave you a life you could only have dreamed of on your own, and now you have the nerve to act like you are entitled to burn down everything I have built, just because I happen to fall in love with someone else. His words stung, mostly because they held a small, painful kernel of truth. Maggie had been a paralegal back then, working endless hours for little pay, crammed into a tiny studio apartment with a roommate. Rick had been her whirlwind entry into a world of incredible privilege. But she had not just been a passenger. She had earned her place. She had been the ideal corporate wife, the charming hostess, the tireless charity organizer. She had put her own dreams on hold for his, molding her identity to fit his success. And now he was casting it all aside, as if she were nothing more than a beautiful, expensive decoration. You are right about one thing, Rick, she said at last. I was a nobody when you met me, but I am not a nobody now. What is that supposed to mean? It means you are about to learn exactly who you have been married to for the last 22 years. She started for the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Oh, and Rick, you should probably call your lawyer. Because I am about to call mine. She walked out of that boardroom with her head held high, leaving Rick standing alone in the ruins of his collapsing empire. As the elevator descended, Maggie felt a sensation she had not felt in decades: freedom. It was terrifying, and it was exhilarating. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. She ignored all of them but one, a text message from Janet Cooper, her best friend from college, saw the news, coming over with wine, tissues, and my lawyer's number. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Maggie found a weak smile. That evening, she was a world away in Janet Cooper's Brooklyn home, enveloped by the warm chaos of a real family. Upstairs, teenagers bickered. In the yard, a dog yapped with joy. From the kitchen drifted the aroma of a home-cooked meal. Janet poured 2 very full glasses of red wine and said, "Listen to me, sweetie. A man like Rick never really changes. His bad habits just get more expensive." Janet was Maggie's complete opposite, a force of nature who was loud, had an opinion on everything, and was perfectly happy being herself. They had been roommates in college, and she was still Maggie's best friend after 20 years of living totally different lives. Maggie married into a fortune, but Janet married for love, creating a wonderfully messy and joyful life with her husband, an architect. "I just feel like I should have known," Maggie admitted, taking the offered wine with a grateful sigh. He was always working late at the office. The business trips kept piling up this past year. "Oh, stop that," Janet insisted. "The only thing you should have expected was a line of women chasing after your wealthy husband. You put your faith in him, and that is what a wife is supposed to do." Janet sank into her beloved armchair, a comfy, worn-out piece of furniture that Rick would have despised. "The real question is, what comes next for you?" "I have no idea. For a moment today, I felt strong when I stood up to him. I felt like a different person." Maggie's hands fluttered in a helpless gesture. "But who am I without him? I gave up my career. I do not have any of my own money." Janet's voice cut through the air. "Do not even start. You have been managing a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation for a decade. You have planned events that raised more money than some small countries even have. You speak 3 languages, you have a master's degree, and you are one of the most intelligent people I know. Do not you dare let some self-absorbed ex-husband make you feel small." Maggie felt the sting of tears in her eyes. "I just feel so foolish, Janet. 22 years, and I never saw a thing. That does not make you foolish. It makes you loyal. There is a huge difference." Janet leaned in closer. "Now, what did your lawyer have to say? I have not called one yet." "What?" "Maggie, you have to protect yourself, especially if Rick has been moving money around." I know, I promise. I will call someone tomorrow." Maggie put her wine glass down. "First, I need to go back to the apartment and grab some things. Important documents, my jewelry, anything I do not want to get lost in a messy divorce. Do you want me to go with you?" "No, this is something I have to do by myself." An hour later, Maggie was standing inside her penthouse apartment for what she knew was probably the final time. The space felt completely different, like she was walking through a museum display titled "Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous," circa 2025. The fresh flowers Rick had sent every week, the expensive art they had bought together, the framed photos of their supposedly blissful life. It all felt like it belonged to someone else. She went into Rick's study, his private den of dark wood and leather, where he handled his most secret deals. She had always been allowed in, but she never stayed long. It was always Rick's space, but now she examined it with fresh eyes, hunting for his secrets. His desk was clean. Rick was far too clever to leave incriminating evidence out in the open. But she knew about the safe, the one concealed behind a section of fake books. And she knew the combination because Rick had never thought to change it from their anniversary date, 05-18-2003. The safe was much bigger than she remembered, and it was crammed with papers she had never laid eyes on. Stock certificates, deeds to properties, insurance policies. It was the paper trail of their entire life together, all of it organized with Rick's typical precision. And at the very bottom of the stack, she found something that made her hands begin to tremble. Adoption papers. With her name on them. Margaret Sarah Harrison, born May 18th, 1978. Adopted by James and Linda Morrison on September 3rd, 1978. Maggie just stared at the documents, her thoughts spinning. She had known her whole life that she was adopted. The Morrisons, her parents, had told her as soon as she was old enough to comprehend it, but she had never known her birth name or a single thing about her biological parents. The documents named her birth father as William Harrison of Dallas, Texas. His age at the time of her birth was 25. His occupation was listed as the oil industry. In the margin, there was a phone number jotted down in Rick's neat handwriting, with a note beside it. Emergency, contact only. Maggie's hands were shaking as she took out her phone and typed William Harrison, Dallas, oil into the search bar. The results that appeared on the screen made her collapse into Rick's big leather chair. William Harrison was not just in the oil industry. He practically was the oil industry in Texas. Harrison Petroleum stood as one of America's biggest private oil companies, with a value around $8 billion. The online search also revealed that for over 40 years, William Harrison had been desperately trying to find his daughter. Well, I will be damned, Maggie muttered under her breath, echoing a saying her adoptive dad used whenever he was taken by surprise. She snapped photos of every single document inside the safe, before carefully arranging them back in their original places. However, she held on to the adoption records and the contact number. As she made a final pass through the penthouse, Maggie tossed a few necessities into a small travel bag. While she was shutting the closet door, her phone vibrated with a message from a blocked number. It read, "I saw the reports about your husband. If you're interested in the real story of his activities, find me at Cafe Luna tomorrow at 10 a.m. Be there alone." Maggie's eyes were glued to the text for a moment before she erased it. She had uncovered enough secrets for one day. Yet, as she walked out of the penthouse, she felt a profound shift inside her. For the first time in 22 years, she was no longer the wife of Richard Reynolds. She was the daughter of Margaret Harrison, a fact that could alter the course of her entire life. Once she was back at Janet's place, she presented the adoption papers to her friend. "Oh my God, Maggie," Janet said, her voice a whisper as she scanned the pages. "Do you have any idea what this implies? It implies that I could have a family I've never met. And it implies you have about 8 billion reasons to not lose sleep over Rick's divorce demands." Maggie's gaze fell on the phone number one more time. The next day, she would face a choice: call a man who might be her father, or she could keep fighting to piece together a life that was already shattered. But that evening, for the first time in what felt like forever, she sensed a flicker of something that resembled hope. Perhaps this was the thing that would change her future. The following morning was filled with the sound of a private jet's engines firing up on the runway at JFK. Maggie had placed the call to Texas just as the sun was rising, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number she found in Rick's safe. Harrison residence, a woman with a strong southern drawl answered. My name is Margaret Reynolds. I need to speak with William Harrison. I have reason to believe he is my father." A long silence followed, making Maggie wonder if the connection had been lost. Then a deep, authoritative male voice came through from the background saying, "Give me the phone." "Margaret?" The voice that came through was just as she had pictured it, a Texas accent made gentle by the years and full of emotion. "Is that truly you, little girl?" That simple term of endearment caused something to break within her. "I believe so. I found adoption documents naming you as my birth father. All right, now you listen to me, young lady. I have spent 47 years searching for you. What is your location?" "New York. I am dispatching my aircraft. You stay right where you are until I arrive." That call had happened 6 hours ago. Now, Maggie found herself seated in the plush cabin of a Gulfstream jet, observing the American heartland roll by from 40,000 feet below. She had never been on a private flight. Rick always saw it as a pointless luxury, and the serene opulence felt completely unreal. The flight attendant, a woman close to Maggie's age with gentle eyes, served her coffee in a delicate china cup. "Mr. Harrison is incredibly eager to meet you," she mentioned with a smile. "He has kept a baby picture of you with him for more years than I have been in his employment. How long have you worked for him?" 23 years, and during that whole period, I have never witnessed him as joyful as he was this morning when he got the news you were returning home." Home? The word sounded alien to her. Maggie had never considered Texas to be her home. She was born there, yes, but her childhood was in upstate New York with the Morrisons, wonderful people, who provided her a solid, middle-class upbringing. A car crash had tragically taken their lives 10 years ago, leaving her with no relatives other than Rick. As the aircraft started its approach into Dallas, Maggie leaned her head against the window. The city stretched out to the horizon in every direction, a vast symbol of oil wealth and Texan ambition. "Is this your first visit to Dallas?" the attendant inquired. "It is my first time returning," Maggie answered softly. The Harrison Ranch was located a 40-minute drive from the city, reached by a private road that snaked for miles across rolling hills dotted with oil rigs. Maggie was in the back seat of a black Range Rover, taking in a view that ought to have been familiar but felt entirely strange. When the house finally emerged, it was nothing like she had imagined. It was not a flashy, ostentatious mansion, but a tasteful and expansive ranch house. It was built with natural stone and weathered timber, designed to exist in harmony with the land instead of overpowering it. A man stood waiting on the porch. The adoption records stated William Harrison was 72 years old, but he had the posture of a much younger man, standing tall and broad with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He exuded the type of assurance that only comes from a life filled with achievements. Yet, when Maggie got out of the vehicle, all of that self-possession seemed to vanish. "My heavens," he murmured, descending the steps to meet her. "You are the spitting image of your mother." The two of them stood there under the Texas sun, a father and his daughter, seeing each other for the first time in 47 years. "I have no memory of her," Maggie stated in a low voice. "She was the most stunning woman I had ever laid eyes on, and the kindest soul." William's voice was thick with feeling. "She passed away when you were just 6 months old, in a car wreck on a stormy night, the same way you lost your adoptive parents. It seems some families are just plagued by misfortune. Why did you give me away?" The question hung in the air between them, a heavy challenge. William pointed to the chairs on the porch. "Come sit with me, and I will explain everything." They found their places in cozy rocking chairs that looked out over the sprawling ranch. In the far-off fields, horses were peacefully grazing. "I was only 25 when you were born," William started, his speech falling into the cadence of someone who had rehearsed this story in his mind for countless years. "I was young, foolish, and totally unprepared to be a dad. Your mother's name was Sarah. She was just 22. We were not married, which was a much bigger deal back then. He stopped for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant landscape. After she died, I fell to pieces. I started drinking heavily, abandoned my work, and almost bankrupted the company my father had built. My dad finally cornered me and laid out two options. I could get my act together and be a proper father to you. Or I could place you with a family that could offer you the love you deserved while I pieced my own life back together. And you picked the family, Maggie stated flatly. I picked the option I thought would be best for you. The Morrisons were wonderful people, Sarah's cousin and her husband. They were unable to have kids of their own, and they vowed to cherish you as their own child. William's voice wavered for a second. I promised myself I would return for you as soon as I was capable of being the father you deserved. But you never came back. I tried. Lord knows I tried so hard. But each time I thought I was getting closer, each time I brought on a new investigator or chased a new clue, it all fell apart. The adoption was legally sealed, the files disappeared, and the Morrisons relocated and took a new name. By the time I was finally able to locate you, you were already 25 years old and married to that lowlife you call a husband. A surprising spark of defensiveness flared in Maggie, despite her own rage at Rick. You have been spying on me? I have been trying to keep you safe, William declared with conviction. Do you really believe it was just luck that your husband's business secured so many advantageous oil deals all these years? Do you think he constructed his empire based on his own abilities? His words felt like a physical blow to Maggie. You were helping Rick all this time? I was helping you. Every one of his accomplishments provided a more comfortable life for you. Every single deal I directed his way was my method of caring for the daughter I was not allowed to claim. Maggie jumped to her feet and began pacing at the porch's edge. You have been secretly controlling my entire life. I have been loving you in the only way I was able to. William's voice was even, but filled with sorrow. And now that lowlife is casting you aside for some young starlet after everything I did for him. He is not aware that you are my father, is he? He is completely in the dark, but that is about to change. William's tone became sharp and unforgiving. That young man believes he can cheat you, embarrass you, and just get away with it. He is about to find out what it means to betray a Harrison. Maggie spun around to look at him. What are you talking about? Before William could elaborate, Maggie's phone began to ring. The screen displayed the name David Martinez, Rick's attorney. Mrs. Reynolds. David's tone was deliberately neutral. It is my professional recommendation that you know your husband initiated divorce proceedings this morning. He is also moving to freeze all your joint assets and is arguing you have no legal claim to any part of his business. Maggie felt the blood rush from her head. Is he allowed to do that? He can certainly make the attempt, Mrs. Reynolds. There is something else I must inform you about. There are also criminal charges being pursued. The district attorney's office has reason to suspect your involvement in the embezzlement from the charitable foundation. That is ridiculous. I had absolutely no part in that. I am aware of that, and you are aware of that, but the evidence is being manipulated to point at you. I believe your husband is framing you to take responsibility for his own illegal actions. The phone felt like it weighed a ton in Maggie's hand. What am I supposed to do? You need to hire the most skilled criminal defense lawyer you can find, and you need to do it right now. Maggie ended the call and met the gaze of William, who had overheard the entire conversation. Now you listen to me, young lady, he said. William rose to his feet with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who had just made a final decision. That monster believes he can ruin my daughter's life and just walk away. He has no idea he just made the last mistake he will ever make. What will you do? A small smile touched William's lips, and for the first time, Maggie understood the source of her own resilience. Sweetheart, you are about to see what true power really is. At that same moment in Manhattan, the story was exploding across every news network. This is Channel 7 News, live at noon. I am reporting from outside Reynolds Industries, where sources confirm that CEO Richard Reynolds, divorced from his wife, Margaret, has taken a shocking new direction. Federal prosecutors are looking into claims of embezzlement from the Reynolds Family Foundation, a charity that has collected over $50 million for children's charities in the last 10 years. The reporter, a sharp woman in a bold red suit, stood before the towering glass buildings of Midtown. Employees hurried past in the background. What makes this development so stunning is that Mrs. Reynolds, the very woman who established and ran the charity, is now a person of interest in the theft of money intended for underprivileged kids. At the same time, her husband has very publicly started a new life with actress Sophia Blake, who is rumored to be carrying his child. Inside her brownstone in Brooklyn, Janet Cooper was juggling phone calls, her frustration growing by the second. "No comment, you vultures," she yelled into the receiver, before slamming the phone down on the third journalist in less than 10 minutes. These people are like sharks that smell blood in the water. Her teenage daughter, Emma, walked into the kitchen, a worried look on her face. "Mom, why are there news trucks parked on our street?" "Because some people are fools who believe they can wreck a person's life just for entertainment," Janet shot back as she poured a very generous amount of coffee into her mug. The phone started ringing once more. Janet checked the caller ID, and her harsh expression immediately softened. "Maggie, thank heavens. Where are you?" "I'm in Texas." Maggie's voice was surprisingly clear over the long distance. "Janet, they are trying to set me up for Rick's embezzlement." "I know, sweetie. It is on every channel. But Maggie, there is something else you have to know. I have been getting calls from reporters since early this morning, and they are digging into every part of your life, your past, your adoptive parents, and even your time in college. What are they finding? Nothing terrible, but they are raising questions about how a paralegal managed to marry a millionaire. They want to paint a picture of you as some kind of gold digger." On the other end of the phone, Maggie felt a familiar spark of defiance flare up. "Let them dig. They are about to learn that I am not nearly as weak as they believe." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I am no longer just Richard Reynolds' discarded wife. I am William Harrison's daughter." Janet almost dropped her phone. "The oil tycoon? Maggie, are you being serious right now?" "Completely serious. And Janet, Rick is about to learn that he chose the absolute wrong woman to cross." While Maggie was in Texas, learning about her real family, the media frenzy back in New York had turned into a full-blown hurricane. Outside the Park Avenue penthouse, reporters had established a makeshift camp, their cameras aimed squarely at the building's grand entrance. Rick had locked himself away in his office, ignoring all calls and snapping at anyone who dared to come near. The pressure was getting to him. His normally immaculate hair was a mess, his expensive tie was crooked, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. "Sir?" Amanda said, knocking softly on his office door. "Miss Blake is here for you." "Let her in," Rick grumbled, his eyes glued to the legal papers spread all over his desk. Sophia Blake glided into the room as if she were stepping onto a movie set. Even at 4 months pregnant, she looked incredible, with her golden hair and striking figure, all wrapped in a designer dress that cost more than what most people make in a month. "Darling," she cooed, sinking into the chair opposite his desk, "you look absolutely awful." "It has been a trying day," Rick answered curtly. "The reporters will not give us a moment of peace. My lawyers say the federal investigation is much more serious than we first believed. And now Maggie seems to have vanished. Vanished? What are you talking about, vanished? I am saying she is not picking up her phone, she is not at her friend's place in Brooklyn, and the security desk downstairs said she has not been here since yesterday. Rick finally looked up from his papers to meet Sophia's eyes. This is not going how I planned. Sophia casually inspected her perfect manicure. Darling, I told you that casting your wife aside during a criminal probe was a terrible idea. You should have held off until all this legal drama was sorted out. I could not hold off. You are pregnant. The tabloids were already on to us, and I had to control the narrative, Rick said, rubbing his temples. Anyway, what can Maggie possibly do? She is a stay-at-home wife with no money to her name and no connections that I did not give her. Perhaps. But a woman with nothing to lose can be a very dangerous thing, darling, especially a woman who knows where you have hidden all the skeletons. Rick's phone vibrated with a text from a blocked number. He opened it and felt his heart pound in his chest. Your husband has no idea what he has really done. If you want to help him, before it is too late, meet me at Cafe Luna at 8 p.m., a friend of Maggie's. What is it? Sophia asked, noticing the change in his expression. It is nothing, just another reporter fishing for a comment. Rick deleted the text, but a strange feeling lingered. Who would call themselves a friend of Maggie's and offer to help him? On the other side of town, the person who sent that mysterious text sat in a different office, making an entirely different kind of call. Mr. Harrison, my name is David Martinez, and I am Mrs. Reynolds' attorney. I believe it is time we talked about your daughter's predicament. William Harrison's voice boomed through the receiver with the force of a gathering storm. Mr. Martinez, I have been expecting someone to reach out. Tell me, how much trouble is my daughter in? More than she knows, sir. Her husband was extremely careful in framing her to take the blame for his own illegal activities. But with your resources and my intimate knowledge of this case, I am confident we can turn this whole thing around on him. What do you require from me? For the moment, just patience. Mrs. Reynolds must come back to New York to confront this situation directly. But when she returns, I intend to provide her with every possible advantage we can secure. Money is not a concern. This is not about money, Mr. Harrison. This is about power, and your daughter is about to discover she has far more of both than she ever knew. As dusk settled over the Manhattan skyline, the components of a much bigger contest were shifting into position. Rick was certain he was holding a winning hand, but he was about to find out that other players had been in the game much longer than he had. And the next day, when Maggie came back to New York, the true fight would finally start. The following Monday, Maggie stepped into the most prestigious law firm in Manhattan, the sound of her heels echoing confidently on marble floors that put Rick's building to shame. The private jet had flown her back to New York that morning, but she had returned as a completely changed woman. She was nothing like the person who had run away in a state of shock only a few days earlier. The offices of Whitman, Sterling, and Associates took up a whole floor of a Park Avenue skyscraper. The waiting area was adorned with original paintings and leather sofas that spoke of immense wealth and established power. Mrs. Reynolds, a receptionist with a formal British accent, greeted her with a smile. Mr. Whitman will see you now. Charles Whitman was precisely what Maggie had envisioned, a 70-year-old man with silver hair, dressed in a suit that likely cost more than a new car. Yet, his handshake was strong, and his eyes were sharp and full of intellect. Mrs. Reynolds, please have a seat. I have been looking over the details of your case with considerable interest. His office had a commanding view of Central Park with massive windows that bathed the room in sunlight. Books on law filled the shelves, and diplomas from Harvard and Yale were displayed in tasteful frames. "Mr. Whitman, I have to know exactly what it is I am up against," Maggie said, taking a seat in a leather chair that was probably more expensive than her first car. "I will be blunt, Mrs. Reynolds. Your husband has created an intricate financial maze with the sole purpose of stealing millions from your foundation, all while making it look like you were the one pulling the strings." Whitman opened a large file. "He has funneled money into offshore accounts, forged documents, and is ready to argue that you had both the access and the reason to do it. But none of that is true. Of course it is not, but the trail of evidence he has fabricated is quite compelling. He has been laying the groundwork for this for at least 2 years, Mrs. Reynolds. This was not a spontaneous act. It was a cold, calculated plan to ruin you financially and legally while he walked away clean." A cold knot formed in Maggie's stomach. "How much money are we talking about?" "Roughly $12 million over the course of 3 years. The figure hung in the space between them like a prison sentence. $12 million, an amount that could put her away for the rest of her days. However," Whitman added, and a subtle shift in his voice made Maggie's head snap up, "there have been some intriguing new developments that significantly alter the playing field." "What? What kind of developments?" "Well, for starters, let's talk about your prenuptial agreement. I understand you signed one?" "Yes, but Rick's lawyers drafted it. It's written to ensure I get nothing if we split up." "Under normal circumstances, that would be correct. However, your agreement contains a provision that completely nullifies the contract in the event of adultery or criminal activity by your husband. Since Mr. Reynolds is guilty on both counts, the prenuptial agreement is now worthless." A small spark of hope ignited within Maggie. "So that means I am entitled to half of his assets? In fact, Mrs. Reynolds, you are entitled to substantially more than that." Whitman smiled, but it was the grin of a predator that had sensed weakness. "You see, there is a crucial detail about your finances that your husband is unaware of. I do not have any finances. Everything is registered in his name." "Mrs. Reynolds, are you at all familiar with a company called Harrison Petroleum?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere. "I know it is a major oil corporation based in Texas. What about it?" "Because, Mrs. Reynolds, you are the owner of 12% of that company and have been since your 21st birthday." The information hit her with the force of a physical blow. "That is absolutely impossible. Your biological father, William Harrison, has been accumulating stock in your name for more than 25 years. He established a trust that came to maturity on your 21st birthday, but all the related documents were sealed until you consented to claim them." Whitman produced another stack of documents. "These stock certificates have been held in an escrow account, simply waiting for you to acknowledge your identity as his child." Maggie could only stare at the papers, her mind struggling to process the figures. What is 12% of Harrison Petroleum worth? At its current market valuation, it is approximately $200 million. The room began to spin around her. $200 million. Just 2 days ago, she believed she was facing financial ruin and possible prison time, and now this attorney was telling her she possessed more wealth than she could possibly imagine. "Well, I will be damned," she breathed, echoing a favorite saying of her adoptive father. "There is more, Mrs. Reynolds." Your father also maintained a detailed log of every business deal he ever arranged for your husband, every oil contract, every beneficial partnership, and every bit of backroom influence that helped shape Reynolds Industries into the powerhouse it is today. He kept meticulous records, which include audio recordings of conversations where your husband admits that his entire success was built on Mr. Harrison's connections. Whitman leaned in closer. Mrs. Reynolds, your father secretly constructed your husband's empire as a method of providing for you. And now that your husband has betrayed you, Mr. Harrison is fully prepared to tear down everything that he helped put together. Maggie got up and moved toward the windows, gazing down at the city she had called home for 2 decades. From this height, everything seemed different, smaller, and much more manageable. Mrs. Reynolds, Whitman said softly, a lot of women your age believe it is too late for a new beginning after a marriage falls apart. They convince themselves they are too old, too rigid in their habits, too reliant on the life they have always known. But you are about to demonstrate just how wrong that belief is. She turned around to look at him. What is the first step? First, we initiate divorce proceedings and file for emergency injunctions that will freeze all of your husband's assets while the embezzlement allegations are investigated. Second, we will provide compelling evidence that you are systematically manipulated and deceived by your husband, positioning you as a victim instead of a participant. Third, we will disclose your actual financial standing, making it abundantly clear that you possess the means to sustain this fight for as long as it takes. And fourth, Whitman's smile turned sharp and predatory. Fourth, we will dismantle your husband's world so completely that he will regret the day he ever learned the name Harrison for the rest of his life. Maggie felt a profound change inside herself, a core of steel and resolve that she never knew she had. Mr. Whitman, I just have one question. Yes? How soon can we begin? Would tomorrow morning work for you? Perfect. As Maggie walked out of the law office, she understood that for the very first time as an adult, she was the one holding all the cards. Rick believed he was a master of chess while she was playing checkers. He was about to discover she was engaged in an entirely different game. That night, Maggie stood inside her penthouse apartment for what she was certain would be the final time, absorbing the ambient noise of the city below. The home that had once felt like a grand palace now seemed more like a cold museum, stunningly beautiful, incredibly expensive, and utterly devoid of genuine life. Janet was there, helping her pack, gently wrapping the handful of personal mementos Maggie chose to keep. I honestly cannot wrap my head around this, Janet said, as she secured a framed picture of Maggie's adoptive parents inside a cushioned box. $200 million, sweetie. Do you have any idea that you are wealthier than entire small countries? It does not feel real just yet, Maggie confessed, casting a final glance around the master suite. Just 24 hours ago, I was convinced I was about to lose everything. Now I discover I never even needed Rick's money to begin with. That must sting him a little. What stings me is the realization that my father has been secretly looking out for me my entire adult life, and I had no idea. Maggie lifted a jewelry box from the top of her dressing table. For all these years, I was convinced Rick was some kind of business genius, but it seems he was really just riding on the coattails of my father's generosity. Sweetie, let me tell you something, Janet said, falling back on her go-to phrase. Karma has a truly remarkable sense of timing. Your narcissistic ex-husband chose the absolute worst woman in the world to double-cross. Maggie's phone began to ring, and the screen displayed the name William Harrison. Hello, Dad, she said, the word still feeling unfamiliar as she spoke it. How are you doing, kiddo? I am doing better than I thought I would be. Charles Whitman walked me through everything today. Charlie is a good man. He has been my attorney for 30 years. William's voice was filled with warmth, but it carried a serious undertone. Are you prepared for what is coming next? I believe so, but there is something I have to ask you. Anything. Why did you not just tell me the truth a long time ago? Why did you let me stay married to Rick when you knew the kind of person he really was. The silence on the phone stretched for so long that Maggie began to wonder if they had been disconnected. Because I was a coward, William finally admitted. I was terrified that if I reached out, you would push me away. I was afraid you would think I was just trying to buy your affection after having abandoned you when you were a baby. So, I talked myself into believing that helping you from a distance was good enough. And now I see that I have squandered 47 years being afraid when I could have been building a relationship with my daughter. I do not want to waste another minute. Maggie felt the sting of tears in her eyes. Neither do I. Good. Because tomorrow, we are going to show that snake exactly what happens when he messes with a Harrison. After ending the call, Maggie immediately made a series of calculated phone calls. Her first call was to the society columnist at the New York Post, who had been trying to get a comment from her for days. "This is Margaret Reynolds. I believe you have been trying to get in touch with me. Mrs. Reynolds, thank you so much for returning my call. We would be very interested in hearing your side of the story regarding your husband's affair and the criminal investigation." "I will give you an exclusive," Maggie cut in, "but only on the condition that you agree to print my exact words, and only when I give you the go-ahead." "Well, that is not typically how we operate. Do you want the story of the decade, or would you prefer to keep chasing down rumors that will be old news by this time next week?" There was a brief silence. What kind of story are we talking about here? The kind that destroys careers and launches new ones. Are you interested? Extremely interested. Excellent. I will contact you tomorrow evening with all the specifics. Her next call was to the event coordinator, who had organized numerous charity galas for her foundation. "Caroline, it is Maggie Reynolds. I need your help organizing an event for tomorrow night. Maggie, I heard the news about the divorce. Are you okay?" "I am better than okay. I need you to arrange a small, private gathering, maybe for 50 people, the usual guest list, but it is essential that Richard and Sophia Blake are on that list." "Are you certain that is a good idea, considering the current situation?" "Caroline, please trust me on this. And be sure to let everyone know that I will be making a very important announcement about the future of the foundation." Her last call was to David Martinez, Rick's attorney, who had also been trying to reach her for several days. "Mr. Martinez, this is Margaret Reynolds. I was told you have been trying to contact me. Mrs. Reynolds, thank you for getting back to me. I was hoping to discuss a potential plea deal concerning the embezzlement charges. I have no interest in any plea agreement. Mrs. Reynolds, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. The evidence against you is substantial, and the prosecutor is proposing a very lenient arrangement. Mr. Martinez, allow me to save us both some time. I have no intention of pleading guilty to crimes I did not commit, simply to shield my husband from the consequences of his own actions." "Mrs. Reynolds, I am not sure you grasp the gravity of your circumstances." "Oh, I understand my situation perfectly. The real question is, do you understand yours?" "I am sorry, I do not know what you mean." "You will by tomorrow. Good evening, Mr. Martinez." As Maggie finished packing the last of her personal effects, her phone lit up with an incoming text from Rick. "Maggie, we have to talk. This whole thing has gotten out of hand. Please call me." She looked at his message for a long, quiet moment before typing a reply. "You are absolutely right, Richard. This has gone too far. We will talk tomorrow at the plaza. Come by yourself." His response was almost instantaneous. "What is happening at the plaza?" "Your reckoning." Janet glanced up from the box she was taping shut. "Are you sure you are prepared for this, Janet? For 22 years, I have played the part of the perfect corporate wife. I have been gracious, supportive, and endlessly agreeable. I let everyone underestimate me because it was always the path of least resistance. Maggie taped the final box closed and surveyed the now empty penthouse. But that woman is gone. Tomorrow, everyone is going to meet the real Margaret Harrison. I just love the sound of that name. Me too. As they stepped out of the penthouse, Maggie felt a wave of relief that she did not expect. She was not just ending a marriage, she was leaving behind a weaker version of herself, a woman who had shrunk to fit a life that was never meant for her. Tomorrow, at the Plaza Hotel, Richard Reynolds would find out he had made the biggest mistake of his life, and Maggie was going to savor every single second of his realization. The enormous ballroom of the Plaza Hotel hummed with the voices of New York's most powerful people. Crystal glasses clinked, and the sound of an orchestra filled the space. Caroline had done an amazing job on such short notice. The room was filled with white orchids and bathed in golden light. It created a feeling of elegant privacy, hinting at old money and even older secrets. Maggie stood in the private elevator on her way to the ballroom. She wore a navy blue Valentino dress that cost $15,000. She had happily spent that money from the Harrison Petroleum account she had just found out about. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated style. The diamond earrings she wore had belonged to her birth mother. They were a gift from William that very morning. "You look stunning, little girl," William said, as he fixed his black tie. At 72 years old, he was still a powerful man. His silver hair was perfectly in place, and his tuxedo was flawless. "Your mother would be so incredibly proud." "Are you certain this is the best way to handle this?" Maggie asked, a flutter of nerves in her stomach. "Maybe we should have just allowed the lawyers to take care of everything." "Darling, men like your husband understand only one thing," William explained, "and that is public shame. He tried to ruin you in the most public way he could. So, we are simply going to do the same for him." William's smile was sharp and knowing. "Besides, isn't it about time New York society met the real Margaret Harrison?" The elevator doors slid open, and they walked into the ballroom side by side. The change in the room was instant and powerful. Conversations stopped abruptly as people turned to see Maggie and the distinguished, older man with her. She had been to hundreds of these events before, but always as Richard Reynolds' wife, hidden in his shadow. Tonight, all eyes were on her. "Is that Margaret Reynolds?" she heard someone whisper. "Who is that man with her? She looks different. She looks stronger." Maggie moved through the crowd with her head held high. She accepted polite kisses on the cheek from people who had not answered her calls for days. It is truly amazing how fast people change their minds when you show up with clear wealth and influence. "Margaret, darling," Caroline said as she hurried over. Her event planner's smile looked a little tight. "You look absolutely incredible. And this must be your guest. Caroline, I would like you to meet my father, William Harrison." If Caroline knew the name, she was professional enough not to show it. But Maggie saw her eyes widen just a little. "It is so lovely to meet you, Mr. Harrison. Margaret has told us so much about you." "Actually," Maggie said with a small smile, "I have only known him for a couple of days myself. We have a lot of catching up to do." On the other side of the ballroom, she saw Rick standing by the bar with Sophia Blake. Even from far away, she could see his confusion and rising panic as he watched her move through the room. She moved with a grace and confidence he had never witnessed in her before. Sophia was striking in a red dress that highlighted her pregnancy. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect curls. She looked just like a movie star, which Maggie reminded herself she actually was. "Should we go over and say hello to your husband?" William asked, offering his arm. "Ex-husband," Maggie corrected him. "And yes, let's do that." They made their way across the ballroom like a ship parting the waves. the crowd moving aside for them. Rick's face became paler every time they took a step closer. "Richard," Maggie said when they finally reached the bar, "you seem surprised to see me." "Maggie?" Rick's voice was strained, tight with anger he was trying to hide. "I did not think you would show up tonight." "Well, you're always telling me how important it is to keep up appearances." She then turned to Sophia, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "And you must be Sophia. Congratulations on the baby." Sophia lifted her chin in defiance. "Thank you, darling. Richard and I are very happy." "I have no doubt you are." Maggie's voice was cool and steady. "Richard, I want you to meet my father, William Harrison." All the color instantly vanished from Rick's face. "Your father? That is right, son," William said, his Texas accent suddenly thicker than usual. "Margaret's father, the one who has been looking out for her for the last 22 years. Rick's wineglass dropped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. "You are William Harrison? From Harrison Petroleum?" "I certainly am." "And you are the lowlife who has been stealing from my little girl." The conversations nearby started to quiet down as people leaned in, sensing trouble. "I do not know what you think you know," Rick started to say, but his voice was shaking. "I know everything, boy. Every contract I sent your way. Every deal I helped you close. Every favor I used to help you build your little empire." William's voice was quiet, but it carried, making sure everyone could hear. "I know about the $12 million you stole from the children's charity. I know about the fake documents you created to blame my daughter. And I know you plan to destroy her name to save your own pathetic skin. That is not—" "I did not," Rick stammered, frantically looking around the room for a way out. "Darling," Sophia said, her voice a little higher than normal, "maybe it is time for us to go." "An excellent idea, Miss Blake," Maggie said. "But before you leave, I thought you might want to hear something interesting about your fiancé's business." "We are not engaged," Sophia said quickly. "Not yet. Maybe. But I am sure Richard promised you a wonderful life after our divorce is settled, and he gets his hands on all that money." Maggie smiled sweetly. "The only issue is, there is not going to be any money." "What are you talking about?" Rick demanded. "I am talking about the fact that every single major contract your company has had for the last 20 years was set up by my father. Every oil deal, every government project, every single thing that made you a rich man. It all came from the influence of Harrison Petroleum." The crowd around them was getting bigger, pulled in by the drama of New York's newest scandal unfolding right in front of them. "And as of this morning," William added, "every last one of those contracts has been canceled." Rick's face turned from pale to a sickly green. "You cannot do that. I can do anything I want, son. It is my oil, my contracts, and my connections." William's smile was like a predator's. "It turns out that when you betray a man's daughter, he has a tendency to take that personally." "Ladies and gentlemen," the band leader called out, apparently not noticing the drama happening near the bar, "Mr. Richard Reynolds would like to make an announcement." Every eye in the room turned to Rick, who looked like a trapped animal. Maggie knew he had probably planned to announce his engagement to Sophia tonight. He likely thought it was the perfect way to seal his victory over the wife he had thrown away. "Go on, darling," Sophia whispered with urgency. "Tell them about us." Rick walked slowly toward the microphone that was set up by the orchestra. His face was as white as a ghost. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight. I have an announcement to make about my future plans." He stopped, looking out at the faces of New York's most powerful people, who were all watching him with intense curiosity. "Actually," Maggie said, stepping forward, "I think I will make the announcement for him." She walked to the microphone with the assurance of a woman who had just realized she was in complete control. Rick tried to get to her, but William's firm hand on his shoulder held him back. "Ladies and gentlemen, My name is Margaret Harrison Reynolds, she said, her voice echoing clearly across the ballroom. Many of you know me as Richard's wife, but tonight I want you to meet me as William Harrison's daughter. A shocked murmur spread through the room like a current of electricity. Everyone there knew exactly who William Harrison was. For the last 22 years, I have stood beside my husband as he built what looked like a business empire. Tonight, I want to tell you some truths about how that empire was really made and what is about to happen to it now. Rick lunged for the microphone again, but this time, David Martinez blocked his path. Maggie's eyes widened when she saw that it was Rick's own lawyer stopping him. Mr. Martinez, she said into the microphone, would you care to tell everyone what you told me this afternoon? David Martinez stepped up, his calm and professional look perfectly in place. Ladies and gentlemen, as of this afternoon, Mr. Richard Reynolds is under federal indictment for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The charges are based on his theft of more than $12 million from the Reynolds Family Foundation. The ballroom exploded with noise. Cameras flashed from all directions as society photographers captured the stunning moment. Rick just stood there, completely frozen, as the world he had so carefully built came crashing down all around him. Furthermore, Martinez went on, Mrs. Reynolds has been cleared of all charges. She is now officially considered a victim of Mr. Reynolds' criminal activities. This is unbelievable, Sophia Blake said, her acting skills finally appearing as she realized she had to get away from the train wreck. Darling, I knew nothing about any of this. I simply cannot be connected to this kind of criminal behavior. Her back now to him, she moved through the ballroom, the vibrant red of her dress swallowed by the crowd. Rick's gaze followed her, his face etched with the despair of a man witnessing his last chance vanish. Richard? Maggie's voice rang out above the commotion. Weren't you curious about what happens when a man discards a 22-year marriage for a new model? Rick's expression crumbled, showing the face of a defeated man. You learn that you were never worthy of what you threw away. Just then, police officers made their way to take Rick from the event, and Maggie stood at the podium, savoring a feeling that was entirely new to her. The pure satisfaction of justice being delivered perfectly. May I have your attention, please, William announced, joining his daughter at the microphone. I would like to present the new head of the Harrison Foundation for Women's Empowerment, my daughter, Margaret Harrison. A wave of applause filled the room, yet Maggie hardly noticed. Her focus was on Rick, being escorted out in cuffs as a new realization dawned on her. Some life stories are not just concluded, they are completely transformed. The hall descended into pandemonium, but a profound sense of peace settled over Maggie as she approached the microphone. Camera bulbs popped like firecrackers, journalists surged forward shouting questions, and New York's high society hummed with the thrill of seeing the biggest scandal in years happen right before their eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, Maggie projected, her voice silencing the uproar, please grant me just a few more moments of your time. The room fell silent. They were captivated by the poise of a woman who should have been broken, yet instead emanated a serene power. 22 years ago, my love for Richard Reynolds led me to marry him, believing he was a good man. This evening, I need you all to see the man he truly is. She signaled to David Martinez, who came forward holding a briefcase. Mr. Martinez, could you please tell everyone what our review of the Reynolds Industries financial statements uncovered? David Martinez unlatched his case with the practiced calm of someone ready for this exact moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our audit shows that Mr. Reynolds has been methodically stealing money from the Reynolds Family Foundation for more than 3 years. Worse still, he fabricated evidence to suggest that his own wife was the one responsible for the crime. A collective gasp went through the audience. Stealing money was bad enough, but setting up your own wife was unthinkable. The proof is irrefutable, Martinez went on. We have forged signatures on financial papers, emails sent from Mrs. Reynolds' computer with fake timestamps after he had gained access, and even phony records from meetings where Mrs. Reynolds supposedly approved these transactions. Rick, flanked by two officers, shouted an objection. That is a lie. Maggie was aware of it all. She put her name on those papers. I signed empty sheets of paper you claimed were for our insurance policies. Maggie responded calmly into the microphone. I had faith in the man I was married to for 22 years when he handed me papers for our family's financial security. The electronic trail is unmistakable, Martinez confirmed. Mr. Reynolds exploited his administrator privileges to her email to send approval messages she never composed. He timed them to go out when Mrs. Reynolds was at public charity functions manufacturing a false trail of criminal activity while she had a perfect alibi. A voice from the audience yelled, "But why do it? Why would he ruin his own wife?" William Harrison moved to the microphone next to Maggie. Because he required someone to take the fall for his illegal acts, and he assumed my daughter was an easy target. His voice resonated with years of authority and power. He failed to realize that Margaret possesses a strength he could never comprehend, and he most certainly had no idea that her father has been watching over her from a distance for the last 22 years. "Mr. Harrison," a journalist shouted, "can you elaborate on your connection to Mr. Reynolds Corporation?" "With pleasure." William's grin was dangerously sharp. For the last 2 decades, every significant contract awarded to Reynolds Industries was due to my intervention. Each oil agreement, each government project, and every partnership that brought Richard Reynolds his fortune, I arranged them all. A ripple of understanding passed through the guests. They all grasped the implication. I created that man's entire career to ensure my daughter was cared for. Since sealed adoption papers prevented me from acknowledging her publicly, I directed opportunities to him, unlocked doors for him, and made him wealthier than he ever imagined, just so my daughter could live well. Rick's complexion turned a sickly shade of ash. "You're making this up. I earned my success myself." "Son," William cut in, "you lack the talent to negotiate your way out of a paper bag on your own. I possess audio records of every single discussion we've had, paperwork detailing every string I've pulled for you, and people who can attest to every agreement I secured on your behalf." He produced a small digital recorder and hit the play button. Rick's own voice, undeniable and incriminating, echoed through the room. "Bill, you have to speak with Senator Morrison for me about the pipeline project. Reynolds Industries doesn't stand a chance at the contract without your backing. You are well aware that I am entirely reliant on your network for these state-funded deals." "That recording is from 3 years ago," William announced, pausing the device. "I have plenty more where that came from." The officers on either side of Rick took a firmer hold as he nearly lost his balance. "Furthermore," William went on, "as of this morning, all of those contracts are officially canceled. Reynolds Industries is expected to declare bankruptcy by the end of the week." Sophia Blake, who had been inching her way towards the door, froze instantly. All the color drained from her face as she understood what this meant for her. Additionally, Martinez interjected, "The scope of the criminal probe has grown. We have found proof that Mr. Reynolds participated in tax evasion, stock fraud, and laundering money via foreign bank accounts. Federal authorities project he will serve between 20 and 30 years behind bars," Williams stated with a note of contentment, "provided he is found guilty on all charges," which the evidence strongly suggests. Rick managed to speak again. "This is all fabricated. You're ruining my life because you're jealous that I found love with another woman?" "No, Richard," Maggie corrected, returning to the podium. You ruined your own life when you determined it was okay to take money from charities for sick children. You sealed your fate when you decided to make me the scapegoat for your own wrongdoing, and you sealed it when you misjudged the woman who was your wife for 22 years. She took a breath, her gaze sweeping over the face of people she had known socially for decades. I need all of you to hear this. For 22 years, I was convinced I had no value without my husband. I thought his professional achievements were my safety net. His validation defined my importance, and his affection was who I was. Her voice gained power with every sentence. This evening, I discovered I am the child of one of this country's most influential men. I discovered I possess a fortune greater than I could ever dream. But the most critical lesson is that my self-worth is not dependent on any man's judgment of me. The applause that followed was heartfelt and long-lasting. The people in this room knew power when they saw it, and they were watching a new force emerge in their social world. The Harrison Foundation for Women's Empowerment will focus on supporting women over 50 who are beginning the next stage of their lives, Maggie announced. This includes those escaping harmful relationships, launching new professional paths, or just discovering their own worth after a lifetime of prioritizing others. What will happen to Mr. Reynolds' business? A journalist shouted. What about it? William retorted. It has no value without my business deals, and its reputation is toxic due to his illegal actions. It would not surprise me if the company's assets are sold off by creditors in the next 60 days. As Rick was taken away by the police, his entire professional world collapsed behind him like a house of cards. While officers led him through the throng of people, Maggie caught his final words to her. You won't find happiness without me, Maggie. You are nobody on your own. She regarded him with an expression that looked almost like pity. No, Richard, you are the one who is nothing without me. You are just too blind to see it. The grand ballroom gradually cleared out as journalists hurried to meet their deadlines and socialites traded whispers about the night's shocking events. Maggie remained with her father near the silent microphone. How are you feeling, my dear? William asked gently. Free? She answered instantly. For the first time since I was a young woman, I feel utterly and completely free. And what plans do you have for this newfound freedom? Maggie grinned, her eyes on the glittering city skyline framed by the room's enormous windows. I'm going to change the world, and I'll start in the morning. 6 months had passed. Maggie was sitting on the porch of her new Texas ranch house, taking in the calm sounds of horses and the wind rustling through the trees. The rising sun bathed the rolling hills in shades of gold, while the air carried the scent of fresh grass and new beginnings. Her new house was more modest than the Manhattan penthouse, yet it felt immeasurably bigger. Made from local stone and weathered timber, it blended with the landscape instead of overpowering it. Sunlight streamed into every room, and each window framed a perfect view of the ranch that was quickly becoming her real home. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence of her morning thoughts. The screen read, Janet Cooper. Her friend's familiar voice came through, clear as a bell despite the miles. Honey, you are not going to believe this, Janet said. Karma has a truly wicked sense of humor. What's happened now? Maggie asked, leaning back comfortably in her rocking chair. The man you used to be married to was sentenced yesterday. He got 25 years, and he is not eligible for parole for at least 15. And you will not believe this, Sophia Blake took the stand against him, and in return she got full immunity. Maggie felt a brief spark of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. So it is finally done? It is absolutely done. Rick Reynolds will be an old man by the time he ever walks free, if he even lives that long. And it turns out Sophia Blake is seeing some tech billionaire out in Silicon Valley, Oh, and she had the baby last month, a little girl. I hope that little girl grows up to be much smarter than her parents, Maggie said. And she truly meant every word. Speaking of smart women, I saw that piece in the Times about your foundation. $5 million in just 6 months. That is amazing, Maggie smiled. Her mind filled with the letters she received every day from women all over the country. They were women who had finally found the strength to leave terrible marriages, launch new careers, or just learn to see their own worth for the first time in their lives. The money is helpful, of course, but the stories are what really count. Just yesterday, I received a letter from a woman in Ohio who left her abusive husband after 30 years together. She is 58 years old, and she just launched her own business. What kind of business is it? She creates custom-made quilts. She mentioned she had always dreamed of doing it, but her husband always told her she was wasting her time. Maggie's voice filled with warmth. She even sent me a picture of her very first paid project, a wedding quilt for her daughter. It was absolutely beautiful. You are changing lives, Maggie. No, we are changing lives, and the foundation is only getting started. After ending the call with Janet, Maggie went to her home office, a bright room that looked out over the horse pastures. The walls were covered with thank you notes from women who had been awarded grants from the Harrison Foundation. Each one was a powerful story about the hope of a second chance. Her laptop pinged with a new message. It was from Dr. Sarah Chen, a 53-year-old doctor who had used a foundation grant to start a free women's health clinic in a rural part of Montana. Dear Mrs. Harrison, the email started. I wanted to give you an update on how the clinic is doing. In our first 3 months, we have helped more than 300 women, a lot of whom had never received adequate medical care before. Your foundation gave me more than just money. It gave me the courage to chase a dream I gave up on when I married 30 years ago. Thank you for reminding me that it is never too late to be the person you were always meant to be. Maggie printed out the email and placed it on the growing pile of success stories on her desk. Every single letter was a reminder of why she had started down this new road. A gentle knock at her office door pulled her from her thoughts. William stood in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee and dressed in his usual weekend attire of jeans and a work shirt. Good morning, little girl. How are my world changers doing this morning? We are changing the world one woman at a time, Maggie answered, taking the coffee with a grateful smile. What are you up to today? I was thinking of riding out to the north pasture to check on the new foals. Do you want to join me? I would love that. They saddled up 2 horses and rode together across the ranch, enjoying a comfortable silence. The bond between the father and daughter was still fresh, but it was getting stronger with each passing day. William had shown incredible patience while Maggie learned how to trust again, and she had been just as gracious while he learned how to be a father to a grown-up daughter. I heard from Charlie Whitman yesterday, William mentioned as they stopped to admire a mare and her foal grazing in the morning sun. It was about the Reynolds Industries bankruptcy. The final liquidation is complete. The creditors managed to get back about 30 cents on the dollar. Everything else was eaten up by legal fees and Rick's criminal dealings. Maggie felt a flash of sympathy for the employees who were now out of a job, but she felt zero regret about Rick's fate. What happened to the penthouse? It was sold at auction. Some tech guy from California bought it. William gave a wry smile. He paid about half of what Rick did. And just like that, our old life is completely gone. Your old life? William corrected her gently. Your new one is just getting started. They rode back toward the house as the Texas sun climbed higher into the sky. That afternoon, Maggie drove into Dallas to give a speech at the Women's Business Network's monthly gathering. The ballroom at the Adolphus Hotel was filled with women of every age, from young college graduates to experienced executives. Maggie stood at the podium and looked out at a sea of faces that reflected her own journey. 6 months ago, I was certain my life was over, she started. I was 47 years old, in the middle of a divorce, facing criminal charges, and I truly believed my best days were behind me. The room was completely still, with everyone listening intently to her every word. For 22 years, I had built my identity around someone else's accomplishments, someone else's validation, and someone else's affection. When all of that was stripped away, I felt like I had nothing left. She took a breath, looking directly at different women in the room. But I was wrong. It was not that I had nothing left. In fact, I had everything I truly needed. I had my intelligence, my experience, my determination, and most of all, I had the courage to begin again. A woman in the first row put up her hand. Miss Harrison, starting over is a lot simpler when you inherit $200 million. What about the rest of us who do not have that kind of safety net? Maggie smiled warmly. You are 100% right. Money does make things a lot easier, but money cannot buy you courage. It cannot give you a vision, and it cannot create the sheer will to rebuild your life from the ground up. She walked out from behind the podium, getting closer to the crowd. The very first step I took had nothing to do with spending money. It was making a single phone call to a father I had never met. The second step was finally standing up to a man who had controlled me for years. And the third step was stepping into a courtroom and speaking the truth about my life. But what if we are just too scared? Another woman called out. Then that means you are our human, Maggie answered with a laugh. I was absolutely terrified every single day for months. To be honest, I still get scared sometimes. Being afraid does not mean you are disqualified from starting over. It just means you are doing something that is important enough to matter. When the speech was over, Maggie was mobbed by women who wanted to tell her their own stories. A 60-year-old accountant who was launching her own firm, a 55-year-old teacher who was in the middle of writing her first novel, a 49-year-old mother of 3 who was finally going back to medical school. You have given all of us hope, one woman told her, with tears welling in her eyes. You have shown us that our lives do not have to be over just because our marriages are ending. On the drive back to the ranch that evening, Maggie thought about just how much her life had changed. 6 months before, she was Margaret Reynolds, a woman who lived in the shadow of her husband's success. Tonight, she was Margaret Harrison, a woman who was building her very own legacy. Her phone vibrated with a text message from Janet. I saw a clip of your speech on the local news. You are going to be a force to be reckoned with. All that confidence. Maggie smiled and typed back, that is exactly what I am hoping for. When she turned into her driveway, she saw William on the porch with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses already poured. How did the speech go? He asked, as she sank into the chair next to him. I think we might have just found a few more world changers today. Good, because the world could use some changing. They sat together in a comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the rolling Texas hills. In the distance, the horses grazed calmly, and the first few stars started to dot the darkening sky. Daddy, Maggie said, the word still feeling a little new, but more natural each time she said it. Do you ever have regrets about the choices you made? When I was a kid? William was quiet for a long time. I regret that I was too much of a coward to be the father that you deserved. But I have never regretted the woman you grew up to be. You are so much stronger than I ever was, little girl. You are going to accomplish things I never even dreamed were possible. We are going to accomplish things, Maggie corrected him. Together. Together, William echoed. As the quiet of the night enveloped them, Maggie felt a sense of peace she never knew was possible. For the very first time in her life, she was right where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Her phone chimed with one final email for the night. It came from a young woman in Seattle who had read about the foundation on the internet. "Dear Mrs. Harrison," the message started, "I am 28 years old, and I am going through a really painful divorce. My husband was controlling and emotionally abusive, and for the last 5 years, I have truly believed that I am worthless without him. Reading your story has given me a little bit of hope that maybe I can rebuild my life too. I am not sure if you accept applications from women who are my age, but I just wanted to let you know that you have already helped me by simply showing me what is possible." Maggie immediately began to type her reply. "Dear Sarah, there is no age limit on courage. Starting over at 28, that means you have plenty of time to create the future you truly want. Give our office a call on Monday. We are here to help." After sending the message, she leaned back and gazed at the countless stars dotting the Texas night sky. "What is on your mind?" William inquired. "I am thinking about all the women who are alone in the dark tonight," Maggie said, her voice gentle yet firm. "They are convinced their lives are meaningless because someone convinced them they had no value. I am wondering how many we can connect with, how many futures we can help rebuild, how many aspirations we can make a reality. I am also realizing I spent 47 years believing I was nothing more than a housewife. It seems I was destined for something much greater." William lifted his glass. "To something greater?" "To fresh starts," Maggie answered, touching her glass to his. While they relaxed on the ranch house porch, listening to the serene symphony of a Texas evening, a thought crystallized for Maggie. Sometimes the greatest part of your story begins right after someone else decides to end it. She had discovered that financial freedom, after 50, was not a fantasy. She had seen how women lifting each other up could achieve the impossible. She had learned that a midlife crisis could be a midlife rebirth, changing a person from a casualty to a champion. The most vital lesson, however, was that you are never too old to find your true self. The stars beamed down on Margaret Harrison. She was an oil heiress and the president of a foundation. More than that, she was undeniable proof that the best revenge is to live an incredible life. Her journey was only getting started. If Maggie's story touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, leave a comment below sharing what moment resonated with you most. Hit that like button if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness. And if you want more stories of courage, resilience, and sweet justice, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration. Thank you for being part of our community.